Hello, my name is Richard Saunders. I'm a senior ornithologist in the birds team at Natural England, the government's advisor for the natural environment. And today I'm going to be talking about curlew head starting and specifically the legal protection afforded to curlew and the types of curlew project that have been licensed by Natural England. And I'll then pass on to my colleague Graham Irving, who will be discussing the use of Air Force bases in England by breeding curlew. And we're intrigued to know whether this is a uniquely English phenomenon or whether or not curlews are actually using military airfields elsewhere in Europe. In the UK, all wild birds, their nests and eggs are legally protected. So whereas other taxa, such as mammals, invertebrates and plants, where only named species receive protection, all wild birds are fully protected by default. And so whilst curlews are a resident native species, so you don't need a licence to release them, you will need a Natural England licence to collect any eggs for a head starting project. And if those eggs are taken from a protected site, then in addition to a licence, you will need Natural England consent to take birds from a site of special scientific interest or to release the chicks back onto a SSSI. And a successful licence application to take eggs for head starting will need to pass a number of licensing tests. The most relevant of these, firstly, is that the new project must be proportionate. So if you look at the map on the left there, which shows curlew breeding distribution in England, you don't need to head start upland populations. We've got around about 20,000 breeding pairs still widely distributed around the northern English uplands, so head starting here would have limited or no effect. Whereas across southern and lowland England, there are approximately 500 pairs spread across multiple isolated breeding locations, and the majority of these populations are small and vulnerable to local extinction. So theoretically, the scale of head starting and the number of curlew released could be sufficient to meet the deficit in total productivity across all southern and lowland populations necessary for viability. But whether this could be achieved in practice would depend on natal dispersal, and if the released head-started birds subsequently recruit back into these same isolated vulnerable breeding locations. The next test is around alternatives. So head starting is the last resort after all other techniques have been trialled. It wouldn't be acceptable to jump straight to head starting if there had been no previous attempt to manage predation or introduce suitable habitat management, including reducing losses due to farm practices. The next licensing test is favourable conservation status. So your egg collections must not impact the donor population. This doesn't matter for classic head starting if you're taking eggs and releasing the chicks back to the same site, but it does matter if what you're planning is a translocation or a reintroduction project where eggs are taken from one location and released to another. The next test is that the action must contribute to resolving or meeting a genuine problem. So we have a pretty good understanding about the aviculture. That seems to work very well, but natal dispersal is key. So if those lowland and southern curlew that are taken for head starting don't recruit back into those same vulnerable and isolated southern populations, but instead go to the uplands, then head starting isn't going to work. So as part of any licensed trial, there must be monitoring and evaluation so we can track and see where those chicks disperse and eventually settle. And this avicultural success shouldn't be misinterpreted. So what we don't need is lots of projects whilst natal dispersal and subsequent successful breeding of released birds is unproven, which is the ultimate test of whether head starting can actually help conserve our southern and lowland curlew populations. Finally, there's the reintroduction code. So there is an English reintroduction code equivalent to the IUCN guidelines for reintroduction. And central to this code, the underlying causes of any decline must be addressed, or at least you must be working in parallel to buy yourself time with the declining population. And you must also consider disease risk and the veterinary issues. You must consider the socioeconomics and engagement, albeit this is going to be much less of an issue for a popular species like curlew compared to an apex predator. And finally, it's that monitoring and evaluation. And that's going to be really important for curlew head starting projects. The first of the licensed curlew projects is Curlew Country, based in Shropshire, amongst a landscape of managed grasslands. Monitoring is undertaken to protect curlew nests from grass cutting for silage production on dairy farms, and it's the only true headstarting project in England, where headstarting is used to boost curlew productivity, reinforcing the existing population, with captive reared chicks returned to the same area where the eggs are taken from. This next group of projects are all translocations. So whilst they might make use of some of the same avicultural techniques, they're not actually classic headstarting. So the eggs are taken from clutches in the North Pennines on grouse moors, and they're transported to the Peppering estate in Sussex. And some of the birds are released at Peppering, whereas others have been released on the North Kent marshes and also at the Cranbourne estate in Dorset. The two largest curlew translocation projects in England involve eggs taken under an air safety licence to prevent bird strike. Curlew attempt to nest immediately next to runways on RAF airfields in eastern England, where bird strike has occurred both through accidental collision, but with some adult curlew actively mobbing and flying into fighter jets. Now, curlew have been breeding on these military bases now for several decades, which are very significant in a lowland context. And the large expanse of grassland on airfields must provide a very strong settlement queue, similar to a treeless steppe landscape. Corvids are also controlled, and the airfields are partially fenced, which must also help reduce predator activity. And the persistence of curlew at these airfields might be explained by a small number that must occasionally breed successfully at the periphery, where they escape the grass cutting and licence control. Rapid collection of eggs by WWT and Natural England staff has now reduced safety concerns sufficiently to allow delayed curlew-friendly grass cutting. And the much larger number of eggs being taken for headstarting is due to a reduction in incidental destruction by grass cutting and not an increase in licence control. WWT rear and release chicks at Duchy of Cornwall, at Dartmoor in Devon, and Natural England funds Pensthorpe Conservation Trust, who rear and release curlew chicks at Wildken Hill and Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, where the BTO tag and track curlew post-release.
Continuing on from Richard's slides, I'll expand on the specifics of the Curlew on Airfields project we are involved in. Natural England has been issuing licences to control curlew on airfields to preserve air safety for over a decade, and there are numerous airfields across England which have populations of breeding curlew varying from 1 to 2 pairs up to around a dozen pairs on some sites. But saying that, not all airfields have a need to control curlew. The main problem period is during the breeding season, when nesting adults will physically fly at and see off aircraft that they consider to be a threat. Historically, it was the adult pairs that were removed via shooting, but since the project started, this has only happened on 3 occasions, and we only are aware of 4 occasions also associated with the need to control adults when eggs had to be destroyed immediately. Due to the need to regularly cut grass, which starts in the early spring, and it follows roughly the CAA guidance suggested lengths of 220 to 300 millimetres, it inadvertently provides an ideal habitat for the curlew to nesting, but the need for regular cutting will also manage the nesting activities, and nests and eggs will be destroyed by this activity, with the machine operators being completely unaware that this is happening. In 2017, the wheels were put in motion to find an alternative to destruction of the curlew eggs. It took a long time to clear all the hurdles involved, but in 2019 we held the initial trial to see if the project was viable, and it was. Since then, Eddie, along with our partners, the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust and Pensthorpe Conservation Park, have been working with the MOD to remove eggs that are found either during grass cutting operations or by specialist bird control unit operatives that are responsible for wildlife management to ensure flight safety. As the project has grown, the number of nests found by the grass cutting crews and also airfield maintenance staff, especially electricians working on the runway and taxiway lighting systems, have increased. The MOD airfields will, whenever possible, leave areas of grass uncut around the curlew nest to allow us time to attend the base and collect the eggs, normally the next day. The success of the project can be seen in relation to the number of eggs collected and also chicks reared and released. To date, we've collected a total of 533 eggs, which have led to 376 chicks being released across the 3 release sites associated with the project at Ken Hill and Sandringham Estates in Norfolk and the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust project on Dartmoor.